Hello everyone, welcome to 10 tips for making real-time apps in Unreal Engine 5. My name is Matt Workman and I'm a solo developer based out of Boston, and I make apps / games / sims for the film industry. And if you take nothing away from this other than this next bit, that if you have an idea for an app, as simple as it is, whatever industry you're coming from, I came from the film industry, didn't really have a software, and definitely didn't have a gaming development background. Came from the film industry, had an idea to make lots of little 3D cranes, and I've been kind of chasing that vision for a couple of years here, and it's been successful for me. And if you have an idea like anything like that, Unreal Engine's a great place to start building that into possibly a business and a career. So to get started, I just want to get through some quick tips, like getting started in the engine, quality of life stuff that caused me headaches and hopefully save someone just a little bit of time in the future. When you first get into Unreal Engine, you're going to grab the latest version off the launcher here, but over time you will become a hoarder like me. You will just accumulate these engine installs. They're very big. And the same thing will go from anything from Bridge, the marketplace. Just in the beginning, try to get that stuff off of your main hard drive, put it somewhere else. Plan for growth. I have every version since 4.18. It's a lot of space. We want to get that somewhere else. Next, for Marketplace, any assets you're bringing in, I would really recommend building what I call burner projects. It's just a big folder. I'm going to put everything in there, and I'm going to bring every Marketplace asset. Anything I'm testing is going to go to a different project, and I'm going to really look through it, look at its structure. And the main reason for this is that once you have assets in your project, moving them, renaming them, deleting them, like I'm just going to rename a folder, it's a little bit sticky. Everything's kind of codependent. So you want to be really careful what you bring into your main project. And so I just have this folder of all this stuff I'm just testing, and then I can just go in there and just delete it when I need space back. And the core thing that you want to be checking for is that you're going to migrate only what you need precisely to your main project. You get to look at the dependencies, and your project will get really cluttered if you start bringing in the demo maps and game instances and all this kind of infrastructure that usually comes with it. You really don't want that in your main project, so migrate it in. It takes a little bit of time, but it's really worth it in the beginning. My last little getting started tip here is to create a blank map. Easiest thing you'll ever do in Unreal Engine, just literally nothing is in this map. And go to project settings, make that your editor startup map so that when you start up the engine, nothing's loading, you're not wasting time. And if you end up corrupting a map that you're working on and it's your startup, you can kind of get in this kind of infinite loop of never being able to open the editor. So next I want to get into the Unreal Engine 5 features that I'm using, the things that make this Unreal Engine 5. Why did I move to Unreal Engine 5 from 4? And to illustrate this, I'm going to be talking about one of the apps I make called Cinetracer 2. I have another version in 4.27, but when early release 5 came out, I was like, wow, all these lighting features. Let's see how this goes. It's been a mixed bag journey to get it into UE5, but I'm pretty happy with where it's at right now. So Cinetracer 2 is a lighting visualization app. So this is for filmmakers to put some lights up and see what they look like, right? Unreal Engine's a great place for this. And so the things we're leaning into for this are Lumen Global Illumination, Lumen Reflections, Virtual Shadow Maps, and I don't think we call it Lumen Ambient Occlusion, but that is a huge component of making the lighting look realistic. So Lumen Global Illumination is bounce lighting. It's really important. Next, reflections is for mostly shiny chrome objects. We're going to get reflections, not quite RTX, like you can look in the mirror. It's not quite like that, but it's still very nice. And Virtual Shadow Maps is going to give us what was previously something like RTX shadows. If you have a larger light source casting a shadow, it's going to be softer. So all those things put together is going to make a sort of realistic lighting simulation. Unreal Engine is really good for that. And the ambient occlusion, I'm going to try to pick out a little clip here, is going to make contact shadows. If you have, say, the skylight overhead and you put a ground over it or a ceiling, there will be darkness under it. And this sort of comes all together. So this is a little clip of Cinetracer 2. It looks very much like an editor mode. In the beginning, it was sort of supposed to be kind of a Fortnite creative hybrid, but really it's kind of turned into this, almost looks like Unreal Engine and Sequencer, and some people sort of mistake it for that. But this is just a look at some of the UIs and programming a little bit of a camera move here and visualizing it. But to really appreciate the lighting of UE5, I have a couple clips. This is an interior in Cinetracer, entirely dynamically lit by the lights in these scenes here. It's not much compared to the Mega Lights demo that just happened, but the overhead linear lights, they can be dimmed, you can change the color. All of this is fully dynamic and cross-platform as well. So that is a change from RTX before. This is NVIDIA, AMD, and Mac OS, which you'll see is going to be a big component of the stuff that I do. This is another scene that I've created for Cinetracer 2 after like a pretty famous lighting setup. And other than the really like over-the-top caustics, which is like the cool call-it, if you look under the tables, you would see it kind of fade in, and you look at the bounce lighting coming up. The bounce lighting from the floor and the darkness under the tables, that's what makes this feel real. This is a recreation of a famous stage in LA. I think it was called Popsicle at one point. I think they rebranded, but you've certainly seen it in magazines and movies. Fun one to recreate. And to really show off Lumen here, it is Lumen emissive. Is this entire ceiling, it's just a plane, you make it shiny, or I'm sorry, emissive in the material, and Lumen does the rest. And I've been digging into megalights quite a bit, as one you'd assume, because I will be likely testing that here. Megalights, I believe, doesn't do the emissive side of things, so you would still be doing emissive this way, and megalights is really, from what I understand so far, point lights, spotlights, and rec lights, surprisingly. That was actually supposed to come out, I believe, in 5.4 when it was called many lights, but we digress. So that's Lumen, makes a great lighting visualization. So if anything you're making needs to have realistic lighting, this is a great tool for that. However, Lumen comes at a cost, quite a bit of overhead. To get to, say, 60 frames per second, you're gonna need to be on a high-end gaming laptop. For PC, and on the Mac, you're looking at like minimum like M1, M2 Pros maxes to be 60 frames per second even, right? So lighting, if you're coming from visualization, understandably has a cost. So another project I'm working on is called CamOp Simulator and CamOp. No one will confuse that. It's perfect branding. It's never going to get confused by anybody. But this is a camera operating simulator, and people have described it as AIM Labs for videographers. So you'd have to know gaming and videography for that to hit. But the point being is that the frames per second here, the frame rate, the performance is actually the first most important thing. So in the year, what year is it? We'll just say I only know it by Unreal Engine versions. This is 5.4. I treat this like it's Unreal Engine 4.27 because frame rate is crucial, and you'll see that I'm actually building this for mobile as well. I do not use Lumen GI, don't use reflections, don't use virtual shadow maps. I am in like what feels like the Stone Age of Unreal Engine, having worked in using Lumen for the last couple of years, but then frame rate is super important. So you can turn it off when frame rate is really important, and for mobile, it's also a good idea probably. So I'm roughly targeting 90 frames per second. Really, it's actually much higher, like 120. And we're looking at M1 Pros, and Maxes, of course, are gonna do even better. And on like 2080, 2070, and above, again, 90, really in the hundreds of frames per second. We really need this, as you'll see, for some of these simulations for it to feel good. iOS, a little bit different. I'm currently frame locking for iPad. You can also do 60, but for battery reasons and other things, you may not want to like crank 60 frames per second on someone's phone or iPad. So there's a lot going on here, many views and whatnot, but what you're seeing is a drone, and on it is a gimbal, which is a machine that's going to pan and tilt the camera. And one way that these are controlled are with these two wheels at the bottom. One's panning, which is a yaw, and the other one is tilting, pitch, I believe. And people do this in real life. This is something that someone has to do. And someone is piloting the drone, someone is operating the head. The head is sometimes done with a joystick, but it is also commonly done with wheels. So these are fairly high stakes operations, as you would imagine, and I make a simulator that does just this, that they can practice. And frame rate is very important for this. So just wanted to recap that for Unreal Engine 5, we can lean heavy on the lighting. I'm jumping right into 5.5 and doing some megalight stuff, there's no question. But if your project doesn't require like the most accurate lighting in the world, and performance is like really important, you can just turn it off. It's in project settings right here, big ol' list. So one of my projects, it's all on. The other project, they're literally all off. And I developed them at the same time. Alternatively, if you want to have a section of your map, as it were, having realistic lighting, having bounce lighting, and these reflections, you can designate this with a post-process volume, which is literally a box. So it's like in the box, realistic lighting, outside of the box, UE4-ish kind of lighting. And one example I saw online, not from mine, but it was some game that like it was open world, and the exteriors with all the trees and whatnot didn't need Lumen. They kept that off. But as you transitioned inside to like a tunnel environment, there's like lanterns and it's mega lights, and you can kind of visualize that. They had a post-process volume around just the interiors. They used Lumen. So you can do this hybrid approach, and I'm sure there's even more clever things than that. But those are the kind of ways that I look at it, either completely on or off, or make a little box, a Lumen box. So moving on, I'm going to be talking about macOS and iOS, because for the film industry and a lot of industries, I imagine, Mac is actually really, really popular. But if you were to talk to like most indie game devs or game developers in general, a lot of them are just like, I don't even mess with that. But as you're building for apps, and especially like iOS apps, it's a really big deal. You know, Mac OS, you know, the MacBook Pros, the iPad Pros, they're just really convenient. They work. You know, if you're using an iPhone, it's the whole ecosystem, right? So what kind of goes into making apps for Mac OS and iOS? And I just went to all of the Mac OS and iOS stuff presentations yesterday. So what I'm saying, I double checked it. This is fairly up to date. So this is CamOps Simulator. I released it last month. It's actually been really successful with camera operators. You're going to see this on set a lot. And when I show the mobile version, you can see it, I think, like everywhere. But as we look at it, these are cherry-picked. This is just a sea of Apple computers. As I was starting to put this app together from concept and like asking people, like, you know, like, what do you want? And like, what kind of computer are you running? The most common spec was an M1 MacBook Pro, right? So M1. I don't know when that came out. It's not, you know, it's not a high-end gaming computer, right? So this is like my target spec when I'm going for this app. So for macOS, if you're getting started into it, as of 5.2, I believe, they added Apple Silicon native support. So there was this like really awkward transition between Intel and Apple Silicon, and the engine took a little time to catch up. But now as of 5.2, that's when I started making Cinetracer 2. We have full Apple Silicon support for native. Performance is certainly better. And we actually can still have Lumen GI, Lumen Reflections, and Virtual Shadow Maps. So realistic lighting is very possible. But again, to have like kind of, you know, pleasant frame rates, you do really need the Pro and the Max. And the Max is really the best to get those frame rates there. Below that, it's certainly not uncommon to be at 15 frames per second or something like that with like an entire interior with as many lights as I've shown. As of now, there's no Nanit, or it's in beta. I think in 5.5, I saw a graph, but I was like sitting kind of bad. I was sitting in like that seat, and I couldn't take a screenshot of it. But it's coming, and I haven't heard anything about Grooms, but they're working on feature parity with Mac OS. Probably not for iOS, but certainly for the desktop, or maybe it's coming. So to do this, it does require a Mac computer. This is a common question I get a lot by people who are trying to make stuff for it. You do need some sort of Apple hardware to do this because it requires Xcode. But if you look at this screenshot here, that is my main Apple workstation. It's an M2 Mini 8 GB. So very simple, very humble. I usually try to get the most affordable like Mac of the time that I can get. And I build both Cinetracer 2, Heavy on Lights, and CamOp iOS and CamOp Simulator and Mac OS from like pretty much the minimum SKU Mac you can get. It goes fine. It's not fast, but it gets it done. It also requires an Apple developer account, which is a bit of friction, costs money, it just takes time. It's like $100 a year-ish, but it will allow you to develop and publish apps for Mac OS and iOS. So it's, you know, if you're going for multi-platform, it's pretty worth it. And the most painful part, which I just got confirmed from the Apple talk that they had yesterday, that to publish to Steam, I'd assume for Epic Games Store, certainly for the App Store, the Apple one, for macOS, you have to manually code sign and notarize. There's a new workflow I'm going to show about where it kind of automatically does it, but as of yesterday, they told me that notarizing is not automatic, so you're going to have to look into that process. That is the worst process. That took me like many months to get that streamlined. You're in the terminal, it's bash commands, it's like very stuff I don't typically want to be getting into, but that's the hardest part for macOS. For iOS, good news, 5.3 introduced the modernized Xcode workflow, code signing. Now I'm questioning if notarizing is actually automated. I think it's not. I'll have to look at that, but this is getting more streamlined. Yesterday they were talking about it. They're trying to do this, the packaging of the apps more the iOS way, the Apple way, the Xcode way. So it's getting easier and easier. And I've just started very recently building for iOS and test flighting, which is kind of like Apple's beta. And it's actually really streamlined compared to what I have to do for macOS. So it's certainly getting better and better. Requires the same Apple developer account. I use the same one. And publishing to Xcode, which you have to basically use Xcode these days, it's actually getting really easy. And my workflow is that you basically package the game, then you open up this iOS project, and you hit archive. This is the latest workflow. And then you just upload it right to the Apple Connect store. And then I can just remotely download it on test flight to my, this is a lav, but usually my phone, to my iPhone, to my iPad, and to all my platforms. And if I had an Apple Vision Pro and you do it right for the iPad, it just natively is a window on Apple Vision Pro. So that's how Apple's kind of made this like transition to, what do they call it? What's their branding? Anyway, not an AVP talk, but you know, you're publishing for all at once. It's really streamlined to get it onto all the different hardware. You don't have to plug it all in, so it's really great and remote. So this is a world premiere here. I haven't shown this online yet. It's really hard for me not to post every day about this, and I've had this for a while. So this is Cam Op, and this is the iOS version of it on an iPad Pro Gen 3, which is relatively old, but we have a full walking Metahuman. I was impressed. I haven't been putting Metahumans on iOS before. And there's a render target. We do cap this at 30 frames per second, and we have touch controls as you would want for a mobile-first app. But you can also control it from these wheels that plug in. And this was a fun pickup. I was originally not going to build for the phone, but I was like, let's give it a test. And I think this is like a 12 Pro or something like that. It's cooking. This is a Metahuman walking. We have a camera whipping around, and pretty excited. I think most of the kind of mechanics I usually write, we're switching views, we're zooming in over here. Now that I have this workflow down, it's pretty fluid to design for PC, Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS. They're kind of the same thing. They're very similar. And even the iPhone, though you have the little cursor. I don't know how to get rid of the cursor right now. Again, this is all working through across all these platforms. And this is not because I want to develop for Mac OS and that it's pleasant and fun. It's just that this is where the users are. And I would definitely guess that if you're building apps and you want to reach as many people as possible, that this is a good platform for you to kind of look at. So next, I want to talk about enhanced input. This took me a little while to get through, so I hope this helps some other people looking at it. If you came from Unreal Engine 4, I forget when they introduced this, but I didn't switch to using it until Unreal Engine 5, when the big yellow text got added, the D word, the deprecated word, this old way of going into project settings and just listing all your inputs. That's how I learned. That's, just go in there, W's forward, S's back. Big list, it's always on, was a concept that we didn't have to really think about back then. That is gone. We don't really do it that way anymore. So it took me a little bit once I switched to 5.2 to get into this. So before, just a big list, all the inputs. Now those inputs are basically all little assets called input actions. You right-click, you make them here. I don't know if you can do it in C. I bet you probably could. And you're also going to make your input mapping context here as well. So these are all the inputs. Actually, this is about a third of the inputs for CamOp Simulator, which has kind of like an insane input system. So it's not your average way of doing it, but you're going to have all these input assets in a folder. That's very different from before. And you're primarily going to say, is it a digital Boolean, which is like a button press mostly, 1D axis, 2D axis. That's all it. That's it. You're not even saying what button it does yet. Next, you're going to make an input mapping context, kind of a big word, just a big list of all those. And what was previously in project settings, you would make more of those. Like before we had one huge list, now we're sort of inclined to make a bunch of smaller lists, smaller input mapping contexts. And here, looks like you would want, you're going to say that that input action that you named, in this case I have an example called drone turn, same as any pawn, right? A and D, it's gamepad, that normal mapping. But you're breaking them into different lists. Why are they in different lists? This took me a long time to figure out, to do right. After that, it's much of the same. Your player controller or your pawn can then implement the input action. So this is normal. It's okay, this is probably a digital Boolean, started, triggered. It's questionable, depends what you want to get done. But what does it do when you hit the pause button? You're going to implement it, likely player controller or pawn. But if you stopped right here, unlike Unreal Engine 4, you made the input actions, you made the IMC, you implemented it, and you hit play or run, nothing's happening. No input will ever make it to the game. Different for enhanced input is you need to go to player controller, you grab the subsystem for enhanced input local player, and you're going to add that mapping context. You actually have to activate and add those inputs in. We didn't do that in Unreal Engine 4 or pre-enhanced input. The new thing about this here, the new paradigm, is that you can remove the mapping context. So why would you ever remove inputs? In 4, we never, I never designed entire systems and never did it. It wasn't possible, perhaps. So I have just a little example of how I've come to understand it. There's layering and priorities, but this is a simple version of it. And I try to make anything in Unreal Engine as simple as possible for myself. So we have a player controller, and you might then go to the player controller and add your default IMC. And these are things that are going to be always on, like your pause button, things that aren't going to be changing their functionality pretty much ever, right? And there's usually not many of those. So next in execution, we're going to possess a pawn. It's like a helicopter, here's a drone. So we're going to possess this pawn, and then Epic has this set up for their vehicle template, and I've started to adopt this, is that the pawn itself is going to store a reference to its controls, right? So its throttle, its turn, things that are only domain specific to that pawn. It'll link to that IMC, and it's going to load those in. So both of these orange rounded boxes here are IMCs, and they're lists of inputs, and they're both added to the master list. They're both on at the same time. As we switch to a different pawn, I want to possess a vehicle pawn. We're going to possess the vehicle pawn, and then that pawn is going to then reference like, these are my inputs, right? So now it's steering, now its throttle is driving, it's like a little bit different. And these are all on at this point, and you're going to have conflicts very likely in input, like your WS, your whatever inputs, they're going to conflict. So you don't want them all on at the same time. So what you would do is you would just simply remove the entire IMC from the other drone. And so it's pretty basic when it is laid out like this, and then you might have, if you're not using common UI and you put up a pause menu, W and S before were like moving around, now they're navigating menu, you would just remove the IMCs, add them. That's just not a concept I was using in UE4, and it took me an entire project to get a good version of that working for my current game. So next I'm going to look at some UE plugins here. So as you're getting started in building mechanics, and it's something completely original, you really should be searching the internet, the entire dev forum, whatever you feel like that you can find this information. See if this mechanic exists in Unreal Engine already. It's very likely that something very close to it exists already, and you want to find that template, that one node. If it's buried in C, unfortunate, you can go get it and expose it to blueprints if that's how you're programming. But very, very likely the framework exists already, and you should start building at it, using it for like your prototyping. So for an example, for my cam-op project, I needed what's called a pursuit vehicle. So it's a car chasing another car in pursuit to film it. And rather than starting from scratch, I just went to the vehicle template and just grabbed the off-road vehicle. I just slammed another skeletal mesh on top of it. That's my crane. And then on top of that, at the end of it, a gimbal, right? And just kind of Frankenstein this rig together. It's relying on vehicle movement component, right? Built into Unreal Engine, it can drive. But there's lots and lots of built-in components that you can go surface that are not as well known. So the first version of this, we have literally the two template vehicles chasing each other, and the gimbal has a little bit of physics, and the arm can move, and I'm live controlling the head. So this is enough to get the prototype out, enough to put online, to get feedback early on. And this launched with the first version. It was pretty good, but we had some kind of like feedback and improvements to make. This was like 2 weeks ago. So from that, starting from the base, just like kit bash this thing together with existing assets, we went back and basically built a wheeled vehicle from scratch. So in this case, I have a lot of modeling to finish on the Porsche Cayenne here, but modeled out roughly a Porsche Cayenne. And as the exact same mesh, it's all one mesh, we put the arm and the gimbal at the end. It's all one mesh, doing the wheeled vehicle set up correctly. And then a lot of control rigging. This is actually the cinematic control rig for keyframing it, and the runtime one's even bigger. I'm not able to even show it. But point being, start with like a template, get something rough out there, especially if you are into like showing people what it looks like early, get the feedback, get it like overall running, and then come back and kind of refine and build it out. So the thing to look at with this one is specifically, as a car is going to like, accelerate, the gimbal's going to do this. If it's going to go backwards, it's going to go forward. If the car turns like this, the gimbal goes like this. If you've ever seen behind the scenes of this gimbal at the end is whipping around. And so how do we get the physics of that? You actually have to make it all one skeletal mesh for the physics to work as a vehicle and that happening. So if you watch the gimbal as the car accelerates, it's doing the correct kind of like inertial accelerations from rotation and whatnot. And on top of that, before the arm didn't have collision and wouldn't affect the driving of the vehicle, now it does. You slam it into a wall. I mean, in real life, let's hopefully never figure out what happens when that happens, but this one kind of like reacts and will actually affect the center of gravity of the vehicle. And we tune this to be like halfway between arcade and somewhat realistic, right? So this would have taken me, in my opinion, I launch fast, but this would have taken me too long. If I had taken the 2 weeks to build this originally, that's a little too slow. I like to prototype really quickly, but then after refine and refine. So like, get existing assets, prototype it, get it out there, even have people beta testing it before you get into the final one. That's my approach to it anyway. Another example here, I needed to build a drone, which I hadn't planned on doing, but the aerial cinematography community found me and were like, please do this. And I was like, that sounds like fun. And so the way I made this drone fly is very similar. I 3D modeled this from scratch. It's built off of like an industry standard one, stuck a gimbal on it. And this is just your regular old pawn. This is just a character movement component. You can set it to flying. So it'll kind of just hover. It doesn't really like gravity and like kind of fall down like really. The wheeled vehicle can kind of do that, but it's literally just the existing pawn. Not the most realistic physics. So after that, the FPV drone community found this project and asked for an FPV drone, which the difference is like kind of like your regular drone will just kind of stay level and hover, and it's designed for like easy flight control. FPV drones are completely manually flown, so you literally have to tilt it forward, give it throttle, and the hardest thing to do on that type of drone is to just hover like this. It's full manual, but this is where the industry has moved for flight. And then I tried to take the wheeled vehicle components, and you can use thrust. You can have a thruster straight down, then tilt forward and thrust. And it was very difficult. I couldn't really get it to fly even like remotely correctly. But luckily this came out, I think like even, it says it, March 22nd, fairly recently. Some other developer put their entire FPV drone simulation framework on the marketplace. It's really affordable. They have an amazing Discord, so shout out Helios, save my butt. And I just use a marketplace as a starting place for like a pretty core system here. But this is what that pond looks like. It's a little bit more involved, but this is a rather accurate simulation here. So we're going to care about the total mass in grams. We have max torque per propeller set here, and max thrust, I believe. They wrote it. I just built it. So 3D modeled it. I made this all to scale with what's called like a Cinelifter, and then I put my gimbal on top of it. So building on top of other people's work to make something that really hasn't existed before. So this is just some early footage of it flying here. It's a rather wild system. I've been told that that's the tiny bit unrealistic how the gimbal is reacting to it. But these fly like this, and they do absolutely ridiculous things. And again, another high pressure situation where when you're learning in the field, any crash is extremely expensive. So this community really wanted this for a training simulator, and it's usually operated by two people. One person in like some like cyberpunk looking glasses, like driving the drone, another person on wheels or a joystick. So it's a dual system. So this is kind of the scope of what I'm building for that simulator. And these are really niche markets, but I think that that's actually really great these days, is to build like a specific product that solves one issue for a certain group of people. I think that Unreal Engine's really good at getting really fast prototypes for that. And that's what I've been doing for the last basically 8 years. Next is Metahumans, just some like random tips about Metahumans. I've been working with these since the alpha. I've been making clothes for them. They're on the marketplace, and then SoonFab. And this clip is gonna have a little bit of audio, and it's just some of like the motion capture stuff that I'm planning on adding to basically all of my apps, and some of that's already in there.
Hello and welcome to Cam Op Simulator. My name is Matt Workman, and in this app we're going to be able to train and practice camera operating virtually. Let's get started by learning how to pan and tilt the camera. Hello and welcome to Cam Op Simulator. My name is Matt Workman, and in this app we're going to be able to train and practice camera operating virtually. Let's get started by learning how to pan and tilt the camera.
So I've been, I'm concentrating a lot on like the cranes and the mechanical stuff, but so much of like the simulators and being on set, and how I would like it is that as you like look around, that the other people that are supporting what you're doing are going to be there. At least that's the plan. iOS, it's a little spicy to have maybe 4 metahumans just chilling in the background and pulling focus and stuff like that. But it's the vision I've been working towards since I started building this. And Epic has really provided the building blocks to get this done. Metahumans, I saw it immediately as like a huge component of what I'm building. I can imagine that for any industry that you're building an app for, having a human in it is likely. So I spent a lot of time in Metahuman world. So here's a couple of tips with these. So when you first go on the web app and you create a Metahuman, that name's really important. You probably just give it like whatever frivolous name you want. It's actually extremely important. And these are managed, which I didn't quite grasp that in the beginning. So you make a Metahuman, you give it a name, and you're going to pull it down through Bridge into your project. You make another project. If you pull that same Metahuman down, these are the same Metahuman. If you go back to the web app and change that Metahuman, and you go back to your other apps, it's going to try to push those changes back down to those projects. It's managed. They're not just like you download it and they're kind of just like offline assets. This whole thing is being managed from like, I think of like Epic's Metahuman, like Perforce Cloud or something like that. And this becomes even more important as you upgrade engine versions. The Metahumans keep updating. And at first, that's sort of like a stressful thing. And in the beginning, I was like, let's just never update the Metahumans, like problem solved, right? But they eventually got toes. I was around when Metahumans didn't have toes. They get new net correctives. Things happen. Metahuman Animator comes out. It's like you need to update to have these features. And it's usually worth it. Luckily, that project luckily this process is fully managed. As you update your metahuman to the newest one, it will push those down to the project. It gets really specific. It's like you have a 5.1 metahuman and a 5.3 project. It handholds you through the whole process, and there's a dialogue that's like, we're gonna update these things for you. Do you want to do it or not? So that relieved a lot of stress for me as I went from early release metahumans to 5.2 to 5.4 was a big jump, but it is fully managed. So it's a complicated system, but they're managing it. So if it screws up, it's their fault. It's not your fault. It's completely their fault. So a specific thing that happened is I upgraded from 5.2 to 5.4, and I kept seeing it online that like, why don't grooms work in 5.4? And so this is primarily happening on Mac OS. So if you don't endeavor into Mac OS, you're going to have a much easier time than I have. But the main fix for this, you just have hair just shooting out everywhere. Anything that's a groom just absolutely explodes. Still today, because I think we'll see when 5.5 happens, how it's going. But the fix for this, someone linked this to me on LinkedIn, because I just perpetually complain online. Someone linked me the answer. It's the loveliest. So it's validating my online complaining constantly. You just go to the groom asset, and you have to turn off RBF interpolation. It's always just this one checkbox. You turn it off, it undoes whatever happened in the 5.4 MetaHuman 3 version, whatever we're on now, absolutely fixes it. It does take a long time. You don't want to batch this process. It's like one of these takes like a minute sometimes, and I have a very fast computer. My main computer's a HPZ PC. So that's a huge fix in the early versions of Cinetracer that were in 5.4. If you were on Mac OS, they didn't have hair, so apologies, but we got it fixed. The next thing I see that's pretty common, I've been doing a lot of sequence work and animation work to get these, simulator buddies into the apps I'm making here, is that the head disconnects from the metahuman. It's a common thing that happens quite a bit. So I want to kind of explain what I think is happening. There's a lot with metahumans you could screw up, but this is what I think is mostly going on. So you have a metahuman, and you have a head and a body. These are separate skeletal meshes. If you select the body, switch it to animation mode, and you reference an animation, everything's fine, right? Good to go. If you do this exact same thing, you grab the face, animation asset, play a face animation, not good. The head will disconnect. You've done the same thing to the body and the head. This is what a lot of people do. What's going on? And I've seen many ways of people trying to fix this, like, what happened? So the way to do this properly, there's a lot of ways, but this is the default way of doing it, is that the face skeletal mesh needs to stay in animation blueprint mode, and you need to reference the stock face animation blueprint. This is what it's going to come stock from Epic Games. But you're like, how do I play an animation on this thing? Like, what's going on? So if you go into that stock included animation blueprint, you're going to have this node here called copy pose from mesh. And this is set up so that whatever mesh this skeletal mesh is attached to, so in this case the face is attached to the body, it's going to copy the pose from the body to the face, thus connecting the head to the body. If any mechanic you do disables that node, the head will disconnect. This is the core node that you need to have in that situation. The next one for the default setup is a slot. That is where animations at runtime are going to play montages, and by default in Sequencer we'll play those animations there. So those are sort of an unknown if you've never dug into that. It's really important. There's many ways to do this, but that's the default one. So then at runtime for apps, not Sequencer so much, you would then, one mechanic to play an animation on that is to not reference that animation again that disconnects the head. You would play a montage on it, and the montages play in the default slot there. Another way of doing this is if you take that copy pose from mesh and you put that in the pose process blueprint of the face, that also can work. Then you could reference it, and it just gets more and more complicated from there. But that is the core reason that the head would separate, and that's at runtime. Sequencer is in a completely different machine. Animating a metahuman in Maya with a control rig is completely different than editing a metahuman and animating a metahuman in Sequencer. In Unreal Engine, there is so much logic firing. You can kind of zoom out and think that it's just moving and animating, but there is so much logic firing in this blueprint, so it's a little bit more nuanced here. I'm going to go back. So again, with the body, similar to populating it, going to animation asset, putting an animation in Sequencer, you do the same thing, works great. I should have made a visual for it, but what it's going to say is custom mode, which is sort of leaving letting Sequencer kind of drive it. Again, if you did the same thing to the face that you did to the body, and you let it go to custom mode, it will not fire that connect the head to the body node. and the head will disconnect. And I see a lot of people new to Metahuman animator for the face. That's what they do, disconnects what's going on. So as you would think you would do the same thing to the face of the body, you cannot. You actually have to leave it in animation blueprint mode. The rules are in Unreal Engine, the default behavior is if an animation blueprint is populated there, it will not override it to custom mode, it will leave it in animation blueprint mode. If it's getting buggy, which it does, you would then, well, I would just like delete the whole sequence and start again. That's always a good way to start over. But you would keyframe down that animation blueprint or your custom animation blueprint. Without that blueprint, the head will not connect. This is the core mechanic. But the confusion is that I do this for the body, for the head, it's different. I can see that being confusing. So my last tip here is that UEFN is the UE6 Preview. All right, so this is down the road. We're looking at like 2030, where UE6 is going to kind of all become one thing. And so some of the main features, if you've never touched it, it's for games, it's for kids, it's for apps. Perhaps not the Fortnite full BR version of it, but when they have it separated, I've been looking at this and wanting this type of stuff forever. So if you just said UE6 features up there, right? Native source control, amazing. Remote multi-user, if you've ever tried to set up remote multi-user on your own in your own Perforce server, I would love to not do that if I could get away with it. It's going to cook all your content for all the platforms, so much of the stress that I go through getting it on the iPad, the iPhone, console, good luck getting it on console. I guess you're making apps. Xbox apps, maybe not the most common platform, but you could in UEFN when this comes to UE6. Xbox apps, who knows, that's the next wave. Player stat recording, it has an account already, the credit card's in there, and, payments, all that stuff, pretty fluid. This is being hosted on Epic's Amazon Web Service build, not mine. Lovely, if it blows up and we have all these customers and all these transactions, I'm not paying for that, that'd be great. Built-in system and content, all these pawns that I'm programming and whatnot, to some degree, everything's been done already, and you could probably use a pre-built system to at least get the beginning of your system. Why spend so much time engineering it? There's a lot of nice things in here, if that should say UE6. So since the UEFN alpha, I've had this vision, I've sort of understood like I would like to build this ecosystem. Right now it's tied to the Fortnite Battle Royale, but everything I build is Fortnite compatible as it is now, and the feature set it grows and how that stays compatible changes over time, but my Metahuman systems I build out, the clothing, the cranes, the animations, the camera rigs are Skeletal Mesh Control Rig, Niagara, the really only kind of like programming animation tools we have at the moment. It will get better. But everything I've been building for these apps is actually full Fortnite spec, down to the Fortnite grid. I build 512, 512, 384. All of this drops, boom, right into Fortnite the second I want it to. It will work. It's very unlikely UE6, when this comes out, will require the Fortnite grid and restrictions that are around it. But you never know. Fortnite certainly is a large driver of the direction of Unreal Engine development. So for me, I'm playing it safe. Everything I build for UE5 is basically UEFN. And I'm going to continue building it that way. And this is me getting some of my assets and rigs ready to build some stuff in the UEFN side of it. So that wraps it up for this. Thank you for coming. And again, if you take nothing away, if you have an idea for an app, go make it. Get a community going, and it could certainly turn into your career. UE5 is a great place for doing that. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.